we'll move on to today's speaker. He joined the staff at Americans United in 1987. He's a recognized writer, researcher, and an advocate for the separation of church and state. He frequently writes about political goals of the religious right and other church-state issues such as religion in public schools, tax aid to sectarian education, and religious freedom. He covers the U.S. Supreme Court for Church and State magazine. And by the way, we've got a stack of these in the back. This is last month's copy, and this month's copy just came out. How many of you are members of Americans United? All right, about 10. Okay, well hopefully there'll be at least 30 after this. This alone is worth the membership fee, but also you're supporting the work that we're doing because, as Rob will probably mention, the lead counsel on our litigation in Brevard County is Americans United and his team there. So he's the author of 4 books, including his most recent, Taking Liberties, Why Religious Freedom Doesn't Give You the Right to Tell Other People What to Do. He serves as spokesperson for Americans United, has appeared on NBC's Nightly News, CNN's Anderson Cooper 360, Fox News' former program, The O'Reilly Factor. He also appeared as a guest on talk radio programs all over the country and has been interviewed by print media outlets. Finally, his service to the national movement includes American Humanist Association Board of Directors and Advisory Board for the Secular Coalition for America. In his spare time, he travels to Florida and does talks. But that's not very often because we're very fortunate. This is the first time we've had Rob, and hopefully it'll be the first of many. Please join me in welcoming Rob Boston.
Kind of just stay put here. Can everybody hear me? Yeah. Great, good. Thank you for coming. It's a real pleasure to be here today. It's always a pleasure to be in Florida. It would be more of a pleasure if it were, say, January or February in Washington, but still, it's great to be with you. I was in Sarasota for a few days talking to folks there, and happy to come over here and chat with you today. What I want to talk about today, what I want to do today is something that actually kind of pains me that I have to do, and that is defend the idea of secular government and the secular state. And it's sad that I have to do that, but I do. I want to show you something. I don't know how many of you will be able to see this, but I sometimes, as part of my work, will attend meetings of religious right organizations just to kind of see what they're up to. And a few years ago, I picked up this magazine. This is the AFA Journal. AFA stands for American Family Association. It's a prominent religious right group based in Mississippi. And like I said, I don't know how many of you see the cover, but it says, secularism. Can it be stopped? And then this is like a, steamroller. Can it be stopped? Well, let's hope not. And I'm also reminded of, a few years ago, David mentioned some of my appearances on Fox News, and I did have the misfortune of being on a number of programs on that network. One case, I don't really remember the show, but I remember that the host was arguing with me. Remember, when you're on Fox News, you're going to have 2 opponents. The person that they put on opposite you and the host. So you're going to have 2 opponents. And we're arguing, we're going at it, I don't even know what the issue was, but this host said in exasperation, well, what is it you people want? You people, like we're some separate species or something. And I thought about that. A fair question, maybe presented in a rather combative way, but a fair question nevertheless. So I started thinking about the kind of basis of so much of what we do at Americans United for separation of church and state, and the basis of what a lot of you folks are doing here locally, and a lot of what our chapters are doing is really defending the idea of secular government. Now, we have to be careful. When we talk about secularism, we really mean a legal phenomenon and a cultural phenomenon. I mean, culturally, secularism is just the tendency of people to gravitate toward non-religious things. If you've traveled in Europe, you will notice that the culture there, people will say, it's more secular. Because you don't have religion permeating so many things the way you do in this country. As far as I know, when the Prime Minister of Belgium ends a speech, he doesn't always end it with, God bless Belgium. And it's just the thing that people do in this country, the infusion of religion into so many parts of our lives. That's the cultural meaning. The legal meaning simply means that the government, the state, will be neutral on matters of theology. I mean, that's the ideal. That's what we're striving for. Not hostility, not attacking religion, not suppressing religion, but simply remaining neutral on these questions. So what does that actually look like? I mean, if we go back and if we sort of return to first principles, Well, for starters, number one, and this may seem like a no-brainer, but it's important, our laws aren't based on religion. That's the very first idea of the secular state. The first command of the secular state is that our laws are not based on religion. We are not officially a Christian nation, or a Judeo-Christian nation even. And if you encounter folks in the religious right, and I'm sure many of you have, who make that argument, they speak it with great force. But there's an easy answer to it. Simply to say to them, well, that's interesting. Will you show me where the Constitution says that we are a Christian nation, where it mandates that? Of course, we all know that it does not say that. And in fact, the First Amendment's religion clauses, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. 16 words. Now, as an aside, imagine today's Congress encapsulating a fundamental human right in 16 words. A pretty impressive accomplishment by the founders there. But aside from that, there is a provision many of you may be familiar with at the end of Article 6, which states that there will be no religious test for public office. So that's really the first, I'd say, aspect or feature of secularism, is that our laws are not based on religion. And remember, when people argue for laws based on the Bible or Christianity, and there are a lot of people in this country who do argue for that, what they're arguing for are laws based on their interpretation of the Bible or Christianity. Many of you may remember Barry Lynn. He was our executive director at Americans United for 25 years. He retired last year. Barry Lynn is a Christian minister. He's ordained in the United Church of Christ. Barry Lynn's Christianity is a lot different than the Christianity favored by the people at the American Family Association. I hope that wasn't important. But the point is that there's this range of Christianity in the United States today. Thank you. And what we find is that when people are arguing for a Christian nation or a religious government, they're arguing for a government or a public policy that's based on their interpretation, and those interpretations can vary widely. Now, I mentioned Article 6. I want to talk a little bit more about that because that's important. It's overlooked. At the end of Article 6, there is this language that says there will be no religious test for public office. Now, that doesn't mean there won't be like a pop quiz about religion. Religious test, what they mean is there will be no religious qualifications to hold public office. You cannot be required to be a Christian or a Protestant or any other member or a member of any other denomination as a condition of holding federal office. Now, why is that in there? Because it used to be, during the colonial period, that some states were requiring people to believe certain things about religion before they could hold public office. In fact, a number of states, among them Arkansas, Mississippi, North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Texas, Pennsylvania, and Maryland, still have provisions in their state constitutions that limit public office to certain types of believers, usually Christians. Now, they're not enforceable. They were struck down by the Supreme Court in 1961, but nevertheless, they are still in there. So one of the commands of a secular state is that what you believe or you do not believe about God should be completely irrelevant to your standing as a citizen. That's an important command of a secular state. Yet we know, if we think about it, there are 1,000 little things that go on in our daily lives that remind a lot of non-religious people especially that they are in many ways second-class citizens. You don't have to look much beyond the coins in your pockets, the dollar bills in your wallet, to see that reminder. Every time you say the Pledge of Allegiance, you find that phrase, under God, when your children are saying it in public schools. There. And in Florida and in many other states now, the motto, "In God We Trust," is being posted in public schools. There are things like swearing oaths on Bibles in courtrooms and in other ceremonies. The sort of thing that a lot of people don't really give much thought to, but if you really sit down and think about them, are sending a message. The message being that there is a God, real Americans worship this God, honor this God, and if you choose not to do that, you're really, there's something wrong there. You're a second-class citizen. So, one of the commands of the secular state should be absolute neutrality on matters of religion. The state having no opinion. Now again, I want to be clear about this. I am not saying the state should be hostile to religion. I'm not saying the government should suppress it. All I'm saying is that when it comes to religion, the state's stance should be, we have no opinion. And what you believe, how you worship, if you worship, when you worship, who you worship with, what you do, as long as you are operating within the laws of this country, your standing as a citizen should not be affected. The third point of the secular state. In a secular state, public education systems should be non-religious. They should not be infused with religious practice. They should not open with mandatory or coercive forms of prayer. Now, as many of you know, in the early 1960s, the U.S. Supreme Court handed down the school prayer rulings, putting an end to mandatory coercive forms of prayer in public school. In many states, prior to those decisions, schools were opening their day with recitations of prayers. I'm a native of Pennsylvania, and in Pennsylvania, the law stated that the school day had to open with a recitation of the Lord's Prayer and 10 verses from what the law called the Holy Bible, usually interpreted to mean the King James Version of the Bible. Well, those types of practices were struck down. Now, that does not mean that students can't pray if they choose to do so voluntarily. If they want to pray at the beginning of the day or before their meal or when they're taking a test or wherever they feel that need, they have that right. But the school is not forcing or compelling or requiring anybody to take part. Teaching about religion as an academic subject, teaching about its role in history, its impact on the arts, the differences among major religions of the world. Not only is that allowed, if done properly, it can be a very valuable thing. So there's a lot of misinformation about what goes on regarding religion in public education. But the general rule, again, in a secular state, is that the government does not take it upon itself to impose religion on young students. The job of raising children up in religion, if that's something folks want, rests with parents, not government officials. But you know, we hear a lot of strange things about this issue. Just a few days ago, Ted Cruz said that school shootings were a result of removing God from schools. Now, we've been hearing that for years. I mean, not just school shootings. They blame everything on that. We took God out of schools and look what's happened. Well, there are a lot of problems with that argument. Number one being, I thought that God was supposed to be omnipresent. But nevertheless,
That's good.
There's an old joke about as long as there are algebra tests, there will be prayer in schools. And I think that, again, you have to remember, students have the right to engage in these activities. They simply cannot be forced. Next point of the secular state. Again, this is an ideal. We're working toward this. The idea that in a secular state, religion pays its own way. And you know, for a long time, that we really did understand that principle in this country. Religious organizations paid their own way. I mean, that seems like a no-brainer. You should not have to be forced to pay for somebody else's religion. Well, we're losing sight of that now. We're slipping from that now. And I think you see the examples of that here in Florida, where the backdoor voucher plan is allowing millions of dollars in public funding to go to private religious schools. And that's not just in Florida. There are a number of other states where that's happening as well. And our view has always been that there should be no taxpayer support for religion. Religious organizations are capable of paying their own way in this world. And if they can't, then the marketplace will have its decision on them, whether they can survive or not. But nevertheless, if you think about what religious organizations have done in this country historically, you know, they've built massive houses of worship, secondary schools, colleges and universities, hospitals. I mean, lots of different types of activities with money that they have collected from people voluntarily. The funding is there. I think what's happening is, due to certain demographic trends in this country, certain religious institutions are starting to see less interest or a reduction in membership. The Catholic Church, for example. When I grew up in Western Pennsylvania, I was raised Catholic. We had a lot of Catholic schools in my community. This was a town of about 65,000 people. And there were a lot of Catholic schools for your Catholic parents to choose from. Well, now they're just one left. You know, they've consolidated, they've closed, and because people are sending their children to public schools instead. Well, that's not the government's responsibility to prop up Catholic education if parents have decided they don't care to patronize it. That's something the church has to deal with. But what's happening in some states, like Florida and others, is that these voucher plans are essentially a type of a bailout for religious education. And that is not the government's job. And you know, this goes way back. If you look at the history of this issue, what got people so excited about separation of church and state, what got people so on fire for that principle back in the day, is that they were being taxed to pay for the religion of other people. Church taxes. James Madison, in 1785, wrote a document, famous document, which has a rather unwieldy title, The Memorial and Remonstrance Against Religious Assessments. Now today we would give that a much more sexy title for, you know, the web. But nevertheless, that's what he called it. And it essentially is a list of 15 reasons why nobody should be forced to pay a church tax. Let me read you one of the things he wrote in there. He said, "Who does not see that the same authority which can establish Christianity in exclusion of all other religions may establish with the same ease any particular sect of Christians in exclusion of all other sects? That the same authority which can force a citizen to contribute 3 pence only of his property for the support of any one establishment may force him to conform to any other establishment in all cases whatsoever." So what Madison is saying here is, look, if they can force you to pay even 3 cents to support somebody else's religion, what else can they force you to do? To abide by the tenets of that faith. A very good argument. And by the way, if you've never actually read the Madison's Memorial and Remonstrance, I would recommend you Google it and read it, because what's amazing about it is, for something written in 1785, all of the arguments are relevant today and just as powerful. It is one of the most powerful, I would say, documents that rebukes the people who believe that church and state should be combined, because it simply states why that is a fundamental violation of conscience to force someone to support someone else's religion. A number of our states, including Florida, do have provisions in their own state constitutions that restrict funding of religious institutions. But courts are either sometimes ignoring those provisions, or complicated schemes are being devised by legislatures that get around them. So you just need to be aware that this is a serious problem in the country right now. From vouchers to faith-based initiatives to historic preservation. We have churches arguing in some parts of the country, oh, our building is really old and it's interesting historically, and we think the taxpayer should help us fix it up because it's falling into disrepair. And look, I love historic buildings. I love history. I want those buildings to survive. But I also want the people who worship in those houses of worship to pay the money to fix those buildings up. These are not museums. If they were museums, it would be okay. They're not museums. They are houses of worship. They have active congregations. The people sitting in the pew need to be able to raise the money for those houses of worship, for all of their projects. Next point. A secular state does not elevate the symbols of one faith over others, or say that certain religious symbols speak for all of us. And we know all about these types of disputes all over the country, including a very active one here in Florida, in Pensacola, where there's a cross, the Bayview Cross, in a public park that has been challenged, and a court has ruled that it should come down, but that's being appealed. There's also a situation right now, not far from where I live, in Bladensburg, Maryland, with a gigantic cross that's sitting in a prominent intersection, maintained by the state of Maryland. Now, the interesting thing about these cases with crosses is that if you go back and you look at the time the cross was erected, usually the story is very clear. It's plain. The cross was erected for religious purposes. Wow, big surprise, right? I mean, it is a cross after all. The preeminent symbol of Christianity. Yes, they erected it for religious purposes. In San Diego, not far outside of San Diego, there's a giant cross that was put up there because they wanted to have, on top of a mountain, because they wanted to have sunrise services at Easter. Now, years later, when this cross was challenged, suddenly people started saying, oh, it's a war memorial. It memorializes the people who have died in the wars. It's not religious. Well, first of all, it's a cross, okay? It's not religious. Secondly, okay, maybe even if you're saying it's a war memorial, does it memorialize Jews? Does it memorialize Buddhists? Does it memorialize atheists, humanists, Hindus? It does not. It memorializes Christians.
Absolutely.
The purpose of a war memorial is to honor everyone who gave their lives, not just some people. Yet these arguments are being made and these types of disputes are going on. We see them in other states where the 10 Commandments are being displayed at the seat of government, people arguing, this is the source of all of our law. It's wrong, it's not true, but they argue that. Our old friend Roy Moore in Alabama, we fought him for this for years, So you see these types of displays, people arguing that their symbol should be the one that's erected. And they don't want competing messages out there. And remember, there are certain cases where if you have a truly open forum, you can bring lots of different symbols into that forum. That's allowed, temporarily. There was a situation here in Florida a couple years ago, some of you might remember, at the state capitol. They wanted to put a nativity scene in the rotunda of the state capitol in December. So they had a Christian group bring the nativity scene into the rotunda. But immediately people started to say, well, wait a minute. The rotunda is the people's house. And you've got one religious symbol there. And they said, okay, well, you can bring some other things in. So a Jewish group came in with a menorah, and they put that up. And I think, a couple other groups came in. But then this guy said he wanted to put up a Festivus pole made out of Budweiser cans. And they fussed and they fought, but they said, okay, bring it in. So he brought in the pole. Then this group called the Satanic Temple said, we want to put up a diorama of an angel falling into a pit of fire. And the officials at the rotunda said, no, that's too far. We're not going to allow that. So they called us at Americans United. And we called up the officials in the state capitol, and we said, you have 24 hours to put that display up, or we'll meet you in court. And they put it up. Next year, surprisingly, they decided maybe they weren't going to have any religious displays in the state capitol. Next point. And I've touched on this, but I want to flesh it out a little more. A secular state has no opinion on matters of theology. Now let me tell you how this works on the ground. There's something going on right here, I know you're familiar with it, in this county about prayers for county commissions here in Florida, in Brevard County, and other parts of the country. We have been fighting this issue. We just had a ruling recently in Pennsylvania. The House of Representatives in Pennsylvania had a policy where they would allow a guest minister or a guest chaplain or just a guest come in and recite a invocation before the session begins. But they were not extending that right to non-believers or humanists. In fact, they had a written policy that said you had to be a member of a religious community. Now, the Supreme Court a couple years ago did hand down an unfortunate ruling in a case from New York State that we litigated at Americans United. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out the way we wanted, challenging prayers before a city council in the town of Greece, New York. So this was allowed, even though the prayers were overwhelmingly Christian. However, the court did say in that ruling that it's a good idea to be more inclusive. That if you're going to have these prayers, and they said they were okay because there's a long tradition of them in our history, be more inclusive. So we took the court at its word. And we've been saying, look, when they say inclusive, they don't just mean different types of Christians. They mean Jews, they mean Buddhists, they mean Muslims, they mean Hindus, and yes, they mean atheists and humanists as well. There are plenty of people in Pennsylvania, just as there are here in Brevard County, who are interested in offering those type of secular invocations. So we won the case in Pennsylvania, we won the case in Brevard County, both are on appeal. But my point is that, yeah, it would probably be better if we didn't have these official prayers before government meetings, but the precedent is not on our side. So in a case like that, what we're trying to do is simply bring more diversity into this arrangement, so that at least a couple of times a year, the lawmakers can experience a humanist invocation, a non-religious invocation, and realize that they don't have anything to fear from that. Now, aside from that issue, we have numerous issues of the ceremonial use of religion that I've touched upon, the use of "In God We Trust." And it's funny, sometimes when I talk to people on the more conservative end of things, they really do believe that, like George Washington sat down and he designed the very first penny, and he put "In God We Trust" on it, and then he stamped Abraham Lincoln's picture on it, right? It didn't work out that way, okay? That phrase did not appear on coins until the time of the Civil War. There was a minister in Pennsylvania who was concerned that the war, as you might remember in the early years of the war, wasn't really going too well for the North. He believed that the Civil War was God's punishment on the nation because we had neglected to mention God in our Constitution. One way to resolve that matter, he felt, would be to put a reference to God on our currency. The phrase he recommended was, "God is our trust." The Secretary of the Treasury at the time was a man named Salmon Chase, and he thought it was a good idea, but he tweaked the phrase a little bit. from God is our trust to in God we trust. And they started putting it on. They had weird money back then. It was a thing called a 3-cent nickel. So they started putting it on this 3-cent nickel. They used it sporadically. It was not codified according to U.S. law until 1956. What else happened in 1956? They put under God in the Pledge of Allegiance. When that was written in 1892, the Pledge of Allegiance, by Francis Bellamy, a socialist and a minister, it did not have a reference to God in it. It was written to mark the 400th anniversary of Columbus's voyage, and it didn't say under God. So they put that in there in 1956. They made under God, in God we trust, the official motto. They started putting it on money. Why did they do all this stuff in 1956? What was happening in 1956? The ideological struggle with godless communism. So we had to show that we were different than those folks, better than those folks, and they chose this embrace of ceremonial religion as the way to do it. And we're stuck with it many years later. And sometimes people say to me, you know what, it's not a big deal. Well, if you think about it, it is kind of a big deal. It says, in God we trust. One God. Not 10 gods, not 20 gods, not no God. One God. We trust in that God. We, the people, everyone. Even though, obviously not everyone does. There's something good and positive and wonderful about trusting in that God. That's the message sent. That's what real Americans do. And if you don't do it, there's something wrong with you. And now this is being posted in our public schools. Sending a message every day to the children who go into those schools who may not believe in God that they're second-class citizens. That is what is happening. It's not harmless. And the sad thing is, the motto that we were using unofficially before in God we trust, e pluribus unum, that was never the official motto. It was just sort of unofficially filling that role. It's a much better motto. I mean, first of all, it's in Latin, so it just adds a touch of class, right? Latin always does that. But what it says, out of many one, I mean, one coming out of many, it's a very powerful statement. So we need to get back to that, but that's going to be a long-term project, I'll be honest. Courts have not been very receptive to the various lawsuits that have been raised. But I'm hoping that as more Americans adopt the secular outlook, as the rise of the so-called nuns, people who say they have no religion when they're asked, become more prominent, more active, people will take a second look at some of these issues. Right now, it's not really on any court or any politician's radar screen, but maybe at some point in the future. And that next point, secular states do not preference religion. They do not extend benefits to religion legally or even culturally. Let me give you some examples of this. Yeah, I hear these folks in the religious right complain constantly about persecution. We're being persecuted. Oh, we can't even do anything. They say it all the time. In fact, the law, by culture and custom, gives them incredible benefits. I mean, not only are they tax exempt, which is, a very desirable benefit right off the bat, they are also oftentimes exempt from laws that other organizations are expected to follow. Now, sometimes these exemptions may be mandated because of the First Amendment, but oftentimes they're just extended because lawmakers decide that they want to give another benefit to religious organizations. I'll give you an example. In many states, several states, religiously run daycare centers are exempt from any type of oversight from the government. Normally, the daycare center, you're going to have government officials in there, inspectors, making sure that place is safe. Do they have a staffing ratio that's required by law? Do they have, mandated breaks? Are they providing nutrition? Are they doing the stuff that they have to do to make sure those kids are safe? Because these are little kids in a daycare center. But religious daycare centers in some parts of the country are entirely exempt. Nobody knows what's going on there, and the results have been pretty predictable. There have been some pretty bad things happening in some of those centers. So my point is that the law should not be preferencing these religious organizations when it threatens people's health and safety. Think about the scandal in the Catholic Church. Now, I mentioned being from Western Pennsylvania. The diocese where I grew up in, Altoona, Johnstown, was one of the ones most hit heavily with that. And when I read that first report from the Attorney General in Pennsylvania, it was like being punched in the gut. I recognized the names of the churches. I recognized the names of the communities. I was familiar with so much of what was going on there to hear about this. Why did this happen? Imagine a secular corporation having a policy of an executive offending, attacking, sexually assaulting young children. And instead of calling the police, the corporation sends that guy to another branch office in another part of the country. Doesn't get him any help, doesn't put him in for treatment, just sends him away, and he does it again. Why did this happen? How did this happen? Because the law preferenced the church. So many examples in these reports of local officials being afraid to go up against church power, or worrying that it would somehow sully the church's image if a priest were arrested or a bishop were called to account. And it has taken lawsuits in the civil courts for people to get a measure of justice. There's been very little activity in the criminal courts over this because of the way the law preferences religious organizations. Now, when I lay all this out, sometimes people will think, well, there are some problems, there are some concerns, but religion does so much good stuff for Americans, and it does so much good stuff for society. And look, yes, there are some good things that are done. I mean, they provide a lot of social services for people, and there's a lot of that activity out there. But we have to remember, religion exists on a spectrum in this country. And there are some people who are motivated really and truly by their desire to be of service to others and to help others. And there are other people who are motivated because they just want to win another convert and another soul. And in those cases, I think we really need to be careful about steering tax money toward groups that are trying to proselytize. And I also think we need to drill a little bit deeper sometimes and just ask and challenge the government. The government constantly sends this message that being involved with religion is a good and a positive thing and that you ought to do it. Well, does it help society if large segments of our population are rejecting modern science? Does it help society if a large segment of our population is misogynistic? Does it help our society if a large number of the population believes bizarre stories about the end times they got from a Tim LaHaye novel? Does it help us if that type of an attitude is widespread and adopted by people who are walking around expecting to be educated, productive citizens? That's the question nobody really asks. And of course the government cannot ever get into the business of oppressing or suppressing or trying to keep down any religious expression, but it certainly doesn't have to continue to promote it, which it does constantly. A secular state recognizes the divide between religion and politics, understands that things like church-based politicking and the Johnson Amendment, which curbs the ability of religious organizations to endorse or oppose candidates, is a good thing. Also, a secular state puts everybody on an even keel when it comes to things like lobbying. People sometimes ask me, well, how much is the Catholic Church spending on lobbying in Washington, and the Mormons? How much are they spending? Nobody knows. They aren't required to tell anybody. Now we are, at Americans United, we've got strict rules about the amount of lobbying we can do because of our tax-exempt status. It's a percentage. And if we violate that percentage by even one tiny bit, we're going to get a fine. Religious organizations are entirely exempt from those regulations. They don't have to tell anybody what they're doing. There are a couple of states that have minimal reporting requirements. In California, they have one of those. Remember the big fight over Prop 8 a few years ago, same-sex marriage ballot initiative in California? Turned out the Mormons had spent something like $150 million. And the only reason that came to light was because California had a state law requiring disclosure. But those laws are few and far between. And in the states that have them, religious organizations fight constantly to overturn them. Just as in Pennsylvania, to go back a minute to what I said a minute ago about the clergy abuse scandal, there have been attempts in Pennsylvania and in New York to expand the statute of limitations so that people who were victims of this abuse can bring lawsuits. And the church lobbyists have been fighting those constantly. And they have been, unfortunately, managing to block those pieces of legislation. And again, I'm not saying that they shouldn't be allowed to lobby. I'm not saying they shouldn't be allowed to have a voice. All I'm saying is, if we can tell the public how much we're spending on lobbying, they can too. A secular state recognizes that the rights of one person should not depend upon the faith of another. This is an extremely important issue right now. We have secular businesses arguing that they should have the right to refuse service to entire classes of individuals because of the owner's particular religious beliefs, or a corporation arguing that he should be able, an owner of a corporation arguing that he should be able to deny birth control in the employee health care plan because he finds it objectionable. Now, again, these are secular businesses. Nobody disputes that a church or a house of worship would have the right to do these things, but Hobby Lobby is a nationwide chain of craft stores. It's not a nationwide chain of churches. And they are winning the right to do these things. And if you look back in our history, you don't have to go back too far to see other times when we had these types of practices occurring, where we had business owners saying, I'm not going to serve certain classes of people. They can't come in my restaurant. They can't come into my hotel. They can't be here. That was Jim Crow. We worked hard to overturn that. Now we are seeing people attempting to impose a faith-based Jim Crow on us. And at this time, instead of the African American community being targeted, it is largely the LGBTQ community. People simply saying, we're not going to serve these individuals again. These are secular businesses, bakeries, florists, people who make wedding invitations, and so on, saying there's entire classes of individuals we're not going to serve. Historically, the free exercise and the freedom of religion in this country meant that you had the right to gather with people, to worship, to open a house of worship, to pray, to read religious books, to write religious books, to proselytize, to go out into the public on your own time, with your own dime, and spread your views. And now it's been turned into a device to discriminate, a beautiful and wonderful principle of religious freedom, forced to wear the shabby cloak of discrimination. That's what we're seeing in this country right now, and we need to be fighting against that. That's the value of secularism. I think, obviously, it is a platform upon which not just religious freedom rests, but freedom of conscience. And a view that neutrality is not hostility. And all over the world, there are people who live under the iron heel of religious oppression, who look toward the secular state with longing. They would love to have what we have here. The arguments against it, and they do exist, to my mind, are not terribly persuasive. One is that people will argue, well, the state should embrace my religion because it's true. Now, there's an obvious flaw with this argument. It has been held simultaneously by theocrats of all religions, at all times, constantly. The fundamentalist Christians say it. The fundamentalist Hindus say it. The fundamentalist Buddhists, and actually are such thing as fundamentalist Buddhists, they do exist. Fundamentalist Jews, they all make this argument. Yes, my religion should be the one wedded to the state because it's true. But the problem, of course, is that you can never prove these things. Everybody has a strong feeling about it, but at the end of the day, it comes down to a matter of faith. And I think what we're really dealing with here are, historically, two competing visions. And I like to say, I mean, I don't know if any of you, as a kid, ever watched studio wrestling, but you know how they used to throw chairs and tag one another and go at it. Imagine sort of an intellectual version of that, with Constantine the Great and James Madison. Now, if that were a physical fight, it wouldn't work out too well, because James Madison was like smaller than me, and sick in most of his life. And Constantine the Great was, according to the ancient sources, a powerful Roman emperor who led his forces in battle. So if they fought physically, well, not much of a match there, but intellectually, they have fought. And James Madison won. Constantine's vision, if you remember, the first Roman emperor to kind of begin the Christianization of the West, was church-state union. It was oppression. It was persecution and death. State-forced orthodoxy. Madison's vision was freedom of conscience, liberty, self-determination. There's not much of a contest there. But there are people who continue to argue in favor of Constantine. Let me just read to you something. There's a group called the Alliance Defending Freedom. They're a religious right legal group. They have like $50 million every year. They bring a lot of these cases into the court. They brought the case on behalf of the baker in Colorado that reached the Supreme Court. He didn't want to serve members of the LGBTQ community. They had a statement on their website a couple years ago. When I first saw it, my jaw dropped. They took it down, but I got a snapshot of it. Here's what it said. The Alliance Defending Freedom seeks to recover the robust Christendomic theology of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries. Well, I mean, I'm joking about Constantine, but they're not far off. They're talking about something that goes even farther back than the Middle Ages. Now, I came here today to lay out this defense of the secular state. I think it's important. I think it needs to be done. But I also want you to be aware of the challenges that we face. And they are serious. And I think we all know that. I've worked at Americans United for 31 years. And in that time, I have continually heard people saying, oh, the religious right, you know, that's a dying movement. That's a spent force. They've peaked. They're on the downside. Yet, here we are in 2018, and they are more powerful than ever. more politically connected than ever, with a president who kowtows to them, even though he personally probably doesn't believe anything that they're saying. And as we look at this situation, we have to kind of remind ourselves that even though our country is becoming, I think, gradually more secular, and as more and more people are telling pollsters that they disagree with some of the tenets of organized religion, as you're seeing more and more people kind of engaging in a do-it-yourself spirituality, all those important things, good trends, trends that ought to be encouraged. We have to remember that we still have a lot of work to do. And we need to lay the groundwork now for things that may not bear fruit for several years. People often say to me when I talk about the secular state, and I outline this vision, how that sounds so wonderful, how can we get that? We want that now. I understand that. Yes, of course, I would like to live there now too, but we aren't there. That's why we need to continue to keep working. And some of the things that we're working on now may not bear fruit until some of us are gone, to be honest. But we still have to do the work, because the next generation deserves that. And we can never really give ourselves up to despair. A lot of people I'm talking to these days are just feeling very frustrated by what's going on. And I don't blame them. And I always tell people, don't overdo it. That's the first thing. Look, yeah, these are extremely challenging times. You are required to respond. Don't get the wrong idea. If for no other reason than at some point in the future, a young person may say to you, well, what were you doing during that period when the entire foundations of the country were being attacked and eroded? What was your response? And you could say, well, I was disappointed that the election didn't go the way I liked, so I disengaged, or I was worried, so I turned inwardly. I focused on other things. I mean, that could be your answer. But I don't think you want that to be your answer. So, do something. You're morally compelled to respond. Now, what that is, that's for you to decide. Don't try to do too much, because then you'll get burned out, and that's what the religious right wants. They're counting on you to disengage. So don't disengage. It could be something as simple as, if you have funds to support local organizations or national organizations, help them in their work. If you have the ability to turn on a computer and write something and communicate with people through the social media, to do that. If you have the ability to speak, to march, some people are really into street action, being out there on the street, do those things. And also, this is important, understand the value of what those of us who are non-religious bring to this country. And I know there are probably differences of opinion in this very room about religion and theology, but essentially, I think members of the non-belief community have been treated for too long like pariahs, and have been treated as if they're not really welcome and valuable members of the American experiment. But one of the most important things that we have done over the years, and we continue to do, is simply to ask questions. Well, how do you know that's true? You're saying that. Do you have any proof? Are you taking that strictly on faith? That is a very valuable thing to do, and I would urge you to keep doing it. And remember this, there are people in this country, forces and movements, that are very threatened by the idea of people who ask questions. And those folks are not so much offended by the answer that many of you have arrived at, which is an embrace of humanism or free thought or atheism. They're not so much threatened by that as they're threatened by the fact that you dared to ask the question to begin with. Because that can be a very contagious thing. So they're very aware of that. And they don't want those questions to be asked. And they certainly don't want children to be asking those questions. So as much as you can, keep asking and encouraging others to ask, and try not to get too discouraged. I mean, there are a lot of things that folks need to be doing. Contacting lawmakers, obviously being registered to vote. As I said, there are rallies, there are marches. I do think that there's a lot of resistance out there. It's an important part of what we're going through in this country right now. And the reason there's so much going on is because I think people have realized how much is at stake. We're not just talking about the separation of church and state that is under attack, even though it is. We're also talking about other fundamental principles, like the separation of powers, an independent judiciary, and even the rule of law. And sometimes a country is tested. Its morals are tested. And you know, oftentimes, it's not a particularly difficult test. Let me give you a couple of examples. Remember about more than a year ago, when neo-Nazis marched in Charlottesville. I mean, actual Nazis, wearing Nazi uniforms, Nazi salutes, Nazi symbols, marched, which they have the right to do. A woman was killed, they marched, they spread their hate. Most of us looked at that situation and said, that's not a close call. There are Nazis marching on one side, and there are people opposing them on the other. One side is evil, one side is good, one side is wrong, one side is right. Yet our president said, oh, there are good people on both sides. Remember when Roy Moore ran for Senate in Alabama and stories came out that he had sexually assaulted a teenage girl and had harassed others? Again, most of us looked at that and said, that's not a hard call. That type of behavior is unacceptable for someone, for anyone, but certainly for someone who aspires to a seat in the U.S. Senate. Yet our president endorsed Roy Moore and wanted to see him holding that seat. And even now, as our country goes through this process with Brett Kavanaugh, I have heard religious right organizations say repeatedly to the Republican Party, if you don't put him on the court, we're not going to be motivated to vote for you anymore. We're going to be really discouraged. You have to do this. You have to push this through. You've got to get him on the court. That's what they're saying. You know what they're not saying? They're not saying one word to Dr. Ford about her trauma, about her experience, or the millions of other women who have had similar experiences. They are not saying one word of sympathy to those people. They are simply saying a partisan calculus. Get this man on the court so he can begin to change things and give us what we want. That is how they are viewing this. And that's why it is extremely important that we continue to fight these things. And I just want to conclude by saying, look, we are still a constitutional republic with democratic elections and a system of checks and balances, at least for now. Democracy is not for the faint of heart. Bad things do happen. Venal, unqualified people win elections. But the core of our system, the genius of our system, is that there is always room for a correction. There will be another election. There will be other experiences. There's always the possibility of correcting the course. Now, I say none of this lightly because I know the scope of the challenge before us. And I am so weary of listening to religious right organizations with their hyper-moralism judging those of us who feel differently. And believe me, they do judge us. They judge us because we stand for the LGBTQ community. They judge us because we're feminists. They judge us because we are progressives politically or moderates. They judge us because we love our neighbors, whether those neighbors are gay, Muslims, atheists, Buddhists, Latino, immigrants, whatever. They judge us. They make moral condemnations of that behavior. Yet their own morals are in such a deficit. And when I think about that, first thing I do is I get angry, but then I get inspired to fight back against it. So as much as possible, I would say to you, the next few years, yes, they're going to be very difficult. But we have to remember, it's a simple contest. We have the internal wisdom of people like James Madison, Thomas Jefferson, Roger Williams, who I didn't get really to mention, and others, against the non-existent wisdom of Trump and the religious right. There is not much of a choice there, and you must resist. Thank you.
Absolutely. Rob said he's got all the answers, so we will give him all the hard questions. And a question is asked like this, for those of you who don't know. Rob, I heard Pat Robertson was that pastor in the Civil War that said God was to blame for the war. Is that correct?
No, it wasn't Pat Robertson.
Okay. That's how you ask a question. All right? Good. Anybody want to try? Okay.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. First of all, just where do we stand on the Johnson Amendment right now and the efforts to go ahead and repeal that? And I'm actually kind of surprised that those efforts haven't moved further forward than they have.
Yeah, well, the Johnson Amendment, as I mentioned during my remarks, is a provision in federal law that states that nonprofit organizations, including houses of worship, may not endorse or oppose candidates for public office. So it's not just a limitation on religious groups. Americans United, we have the same tax status as a church. We can't do it either. And Trump, because he makes things up, claims that he's overturned the Johnson Amendment. He issued an executive order that was just a lot of verbiage. He can't do that. He doesn't have the power to do that. It's an act of Congress. And it would take another act of Congress to repeal it. Now, there have been efforts. They haven't been able to get any through. I think there's just enough conservative opposition to the idea that they don't have the votes to do it. Because think about it. If all the conservative churches are suddenly allowed to endorse candidates and start behaving like political action committees, all the liberal and moderate ones would too. So a lot of people, I think, are just feeling it's better to keep the status quo, and that has managed to stave off these efforts to do away with the Johnson Amendment so far.
Hi, great presentation. I was wondering if you could speak about the Texas school system that decided not to teach about very important people in our history, including Hillary Clinton, but decided to put in the books about Adam and Eve and creationism back on the curriculum for the entire state.
Yeah, that's the Texas school board. Texas has a state school board, like a lot of states do, and they have a good bit of power. They can determine what's the core standards are, what the curriculum is going to be statewide, what should be in the textbooks. And one of the things that they've been doing is putting a very conservative spin on American history. So certain individuals have been removed from the standards and other people have been brought in. A few years ago, they added a standard to the curriculum, arguing basically that Moses, through the Ten Commandments, was one of the true founders of the American government.
Wow.
So, I mean, they're still teaching about, I think they're still teaching or mentioning Jefferson and Madison and people like George Washington, people like that. But Moses is really the guys at the top of the heap there for them. And there have been a couple of other situations where they've brought things in that were very shocking. And of course, the science standards have been impacted as well as they've sought to water down the teaching of evolution. Those are elected positions, and Texas is a pretty conservative state, and it's been very difficult to get that state school board back into moderate hands. So it's an ongoing challenge, definitely. Texas is always an ongoing challenge.
Hello. Thanks for your presentation. I'm wondering, in the case of the Catholic scandals, how is that exactly a case of preferential treatment under the law, though?
Yeah,
as opposed to an organization just covering atrocities.
Yeah, because the government treated the church with deference and kid gloves and didn't come after them aggressively when they should have. There were cases where the bishops did cover things up and state officials weren't aware, but there were other cases where state officials were quite aware of what was going on. And instead of arresting a priest or bringing him into the halls of justice, they allowed the church to continue to just send those people elsewhere. So there were a number of cases like that in the Altoona-Johnstown diocese and a few others where government officials, district attorneys, declined to press charges. There was a case actually in my hometown of Altoona, Pennsylvania. This was in the Attorney General's report. This priest was known to be working in an area of town trying to meet young men for sex, picking them up for sex. And the police department decided to do a sting where they were going to catch him. Took one call from the bishop and the sting was shut down. So that's the kind of thing that happens when there's deference, undue deference to religious leaders.
Hey Rob, thanks for being here. I know you as an AHA board member. I heard you speak many times at the conferences. You're always an excellent presentation. Just want everyone to know that you also write in the American Human Association magazine. They're probably available online, and if you want to read more about Rob and how he writes, I recommend you look those up. You're probably on YouTube also.
A few speeches out there, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So you can really follow Rob more, and especially read his articles in the magazine. They're excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. That was an uncompensated endorsement.
Rob, besides what most of us are hearing on mainstream media here locally, since you're in D.C. in proximity to what's going on with the Kavanaugh hearings, are you hearing any buzz? Can you give us any inside scoop? Do you have a feeling?
Yeah, I'm afraid.
What's the general mood?
I'm afraid I'm pretty cynical about the whole process. I think Jeff Flake is absolutely a thin reed, not reliable. I think the idea of allowing the FBI to conduct another investigation in the course of 1 week is ridiculous. A week, nothing substantial is going to come out of that. But it's going to give cover to people like Jeff Flake and a couple other Republicans who have been sort of a little bit more wavering on this. It'll give them cover. They'll be able to say when they vote for Kavanaugh, oh, well, we had the FBI look into it, and nothing came out of it, so it's okay to vote for him. It's just a cynical gambit, the usual politics in Washington, D.C. It's unfortunate, but barring anything more coming out that's really shocking, I think this guy's going to end up in court.
No.
I know this has already gone to the Supreme Court, but what about the Boy Scouts of America going into public schools and not allowing atheists?
Right, yeah. Well, they're a private organization, yes. And the court did rule that as a private organization, they did have the right to exclude and have these types of policies. That does open an interesting question, though. Should an organization that has discriminatory policies be allowed to recruit in public schools? Now, this is an example of again, where non-believers are treated like pariahs. Imagine if the Boy Scouts policy was that no Jewish kids could join, or that no, I don't know, whatever, fill in the blank. If it were a mainstream religion and they were excluding those individuals, they would not be recruiting in public schools. I can guarantee you it would not happen. But because it's atheists, and atheists are not seen as a minority group worthy of protection that has been extended to others, this goes on. Now, there have been some cases where people have approached schools locally in some parts of the country and have made this argument and have been persuasive and are not recruiting in those schools anymore. So really, it's a case-by-case basis. You're obviously going to have more luck with an approach like that, probably in a more progressive area. But it does happen occasionally. They have been removed from recruiting in some public schools because of their discriminatory policies.
Can you talk about on that same point, them allowing school time, class time, and whether that's permissible, and perhaps how other groups might push back against that?
Are you referring to like private groups coming in?
Well, the Boy Scouts going into class and doing recruiting in class.
Oh yeah. I mean, again, that's just one of the recruiting tools that they use. I mean, and then sometimes if they actually meet in schools, they tend to meet in a lot of churches. But yeah, I mean, that's part of it, that they have this special access, and they have this access even though they have discriminatory policies. So if that's happening, I think that gives you a little bit more leverage to say, look, they're not just putting a sign out in front of the lawn. They're actually coming into classrooms and recruiting, and certain children are not eligible to join this group. Is that the message we want to send?
Right. So if you have your own kids event group, then you should be able to do the same exact thing without discrimination against your group. Is that correct?
Yes, that is true. There are parts of the country where these groups will meet right after school. Religious clubs meet right after school. Good news clubs, they're usually called. And again, the court upheld their right to do that. They're technically not sponsored by the school, although they meet in the school, usually just minutes after the day has ended. But if that right is extended to those religious organizations, then it would have to be extended to somebody who wanted to do it from a secular or another religious perspective. Now, the problem has been building the network that can support those types of groups. I mean, the Good News Clubs are sponsored by evangelical Christian churches that have a ton of money and have built this network up over the years. So it's challenging to get to that level, but again, on a case-by-case basis, you can use that type of an argument sometimes.
I would also point out that there's actually a humanist badge that's being proposed by the American Humanist Association and Florida Atheist Scout Leader. So look for that soon. You may have already heard a little bit about it.
Well, look at what the Scouts did with Gay Scouts and Trans Scouts. That change occurred because there was pressure from the bottom up. And I think that we need to keep that going. The atheist community needs to be bringing similar pressure to Scout leadership. I do think it will change at some point. That hasn't hit the critical mass yet where they feel that they have to respond. But if people keep bringing it forth, it will.
Hi, thank you for your talk today. It was very inspiring. My question is, would you address the use of public schools for church services on Sunday? I don't understand.
Yeah, that goes on. And again, there's Supreme Court precedent in that area. Basically, the rule is this. A lot of public schools allow outside organizations to rent their facilities after hours, so usually the weekends. And what the Supreme Court ruled in this case from a few years ago was that you could not limit that to strictly secular groups. You had to let religious groups do it too. So as a result, churches now can meet in public schools for services on the weekends alongside other types of organizations. Now, schools are not required to do these rentals, but if they choose to do the rentals, they have to have an equal access policy. Now, there are some rules about this. You can't have religious symbols permanently displayed in the school. You can't have a preferential arrangement with one church and to the exclusion of other groups. So there are some limitations on it. But essentially, it's something that is happening in different parts of the country, and usually, if those rules are followed, it's not too much of a problem because this is the weekend. The kids aren't in school to begin with. Obviously, we'd be concerned about any type of evangelistic group having access to school students, which that happens sometimes, too. I mean, we have to watch out for that. There are schools that bring in these assembly programs. I think you mentioned some of those that are religious in nature, and they invite kids to come to church services afterwards. So there are a lot of things that go on in the context of public schools, kind of on the periphery, that we have to keep an eye on. Some of them are okay, and some of them are not.
Two local things on that note. We've surveyed through public records requests for the last 4 years all of the 6 counties that we consider our service area. And how many churches do you think are running schools in the 6 counties around Central Florida?
A lot.
Yes.
100?
120. So that's 120 in 6 counties. And also we have found some of these pastors embedding themselves on the SAC, whatever that committee that each school has, and involved in teach-ins and all kinds of things. So when you've got pastors that are walking around not as guests but as embedded pastors in the school, and they claim to be campus pastors sometimes as well. So we've got to be on the lookout for that. I'm out of question hands. Okay. Okay, I'll be right back up.
Hello, sir. I came in kind of late, so I missed the start of your actual talk. Well, this question is actually something I've been thinking about lately, and I just want to hear your thoughts on it. It's pretty, anyone who studies American history and looks at how things are going these days, it's pretty obvious that this country has something of a difficult relationship between religion and secularism.
Mm-hmm.
How do you explain, what's your explanation for the U.S. being the most dominant nation on the face of the earth since World War II? Is it the secular part, or is that more the religious part?
That's a good question, and I think it's probably really neither. It's mainly due to just the size and scope of the American economy, the military-industrial complex, as Dwight Eisenhower talked about, the scale of the defense industry in this country, and so on. The interesting thing about sort of the United States vis-a-vis other nations to me is that when you look at other nations that have the Western tradition, European nations, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, you see much more secularism both in a legal sense and in a cultural sense. And I don't know if anybody's ever studied this, but my belief is that in the post-war period, a lot of the Western European democracies started to build social welfare states. And one of the things they did was they created social safety nets that helped people through difficult periods. We never really did that here. To the extent that we have a social safety net, it's tattered, it has a lot of holes, and it's easy for you to fall through. And the answer in this country is the answer that used to exist in Europe. If you really hit rock bottom, well, just go to a church. They'll help you. Well, people don't have to do that anymore in Europe or Canada or other countries. They get help from the state. So as a result, in this country, we continue to funnel people through these faith-based initiatives into religious institutions, and that's a great boon to the religious institutions. So, I mean, I know that there may be folks in this room whose economic views are more libertarian or more conservative, but remember that outsourcing state functions to religious institutions does have the benefit of boosting the power of those religious organizations. So it's something to think about.
I enjoyed your presentation very much. I have several questions, but I'll take one first. How can cities and towns who extend the exemption to religious organizations not see that as equivalent to funding those? I mean, I don't see the difference between exempting somebody from paying the taxes Because if they don't pay the taxes, the rest of us pay more.
Right. There's a couple things about that. Tax exemption, first of all. Tax exemption for religious organizations, or tax exemption generally, it's not in the Constitution. The Constitution says nothing about that. That is a matter of law. Now, historically, religious organizations were exempt from taxation during the time of the Roman Empire, when the Roman Empire was pagan, and that was continued over to the conversion to Christianity and carried down through Western European history. Religious groups not being tax exempt. So it was brought to this country, since we have a Western tradition, same sort of situation. So the law says that, the Constitution doesn't require it, the law says it. In theory, churches and other types of nonprofit groups could be taxed if laws were passed to allow for that. But it's never really seriously been tried because there's very little public support for it. I mean, if churches lost their tax exemption, so would Americans United, so would this group, so would the Freedom from Religion Foundation, so would American Atheists, so would American Humanist Association, Sierra Club, everybody would lose their tax exemption. Now, some folks may say, okay, I'm all right with that, that's not a problem, but most people are thinking they don't want to go down that road. So it hasn't really happened. Now, your question about, is tax exemption a kind of backdoor subsidy? Very interesting. Yes, I think there's an argument to be made there. But there was a case that reached the Supreme Court called Walls v. Tax Commission of the State of New York. I think it was 61 or 71, where the court kind of looked at this issue and declared that a tax exemption was not the same as a subsidy. And but again, you know, they went on to state the tax exemption is not required, that it could be revoked if people chose to change the law. But it just hasn't ever seriously happened. There was a ballot initiative a couple years ago in Colorado that would have opened the door to certain types of taxation of nonprofits and houses of worship, and it was on the ballot and it lost like 80-20. I mean, it wasn't even close. There just isn't much public support for it.
Thanks for coming. How do states that have a religious exemption for the provision of health care or the non-provision of health care to children and others survive a test against the First Amendment, and Congress shall enact no law that supports?
Are you referring to the laws that allow parents to withhold medical
Yes.
treatment? Yes. That again, I talk about preference of religious organizations. That's another example of that. Many of those laws were put in place due to an aggressive lobbying campaign by the Christian Science Church many decades ago. And now they've come to encompass sort of the fundamentalist faith-healing families that sometimes will withhold medical treatment. Now, I want to be clear. Adults have the right to refuse medical treatment for themselves, but we're talking about children here. And in some cases, children have died because they haven't received medical care for conditions that are treatable. States are slowly starting to crack down on that. There was just a situation, I believe it was in Oregon, involving a family like that, and they're going to prison. So it's happening, but it's difficult because these laws do exist. And it's necessary to kind of go back and start the process of repealing these laws. It can be hard to bring people into court and charge them with a crime if there's a law that they can cite that says, look, I can do this, I can engage in this activity. But again, that's another example of the religious privileging that exists in our society to the extent that it can be detrimental to somebody else. I mean, at a baseline, I would hope we could all agree that religious freedom, as important as it is, does not encompass acts that harm other people. Maybe some who disagree with that on the right, but I would hope that most Americans would say that they don't think that that's an appropriate interpretation of religious freedom.
That brings up the point of what you mean by harm, right? You know, definitions of harm are often questioned.
We're grappling with that right now. I mean, is discrimination a harm? Certainly, you know, death is a harm.
unless you choose it for yourself.
Yes, as an adult.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. It was so informative and smooth and just so wonderful. I learned so much, and I want to come back for a moment to the Brett Kavanaugh matter, which I think is so critical, not only for women's rights, but for all of our rights and the environment, climate change, everything. I watched 17 hours straight live on Thursday of the testimonies and also on Friday until I was couldn't absorb
Right.
anymore. And I remember that before that, Susan Collins was interviewed and said that if he could be proven to have lied under oath, that would be disqualifying. So I want you to comment on what do you think the chances are of, on Chris Cuomo News on CNN, there were 2 women on Friday night who came forward, Yale Law School classmates, and said that he had lied about his drinking and other things. This is eyewitness evidence,
Right.
and if he's proven to have lied under oath, Susan Collins, that she said at least, that would be disqualifying. So
Is that enough?
yeah, because it seems like you're just giving up on it, but I don't think we should.
Well, the problem with her is that she says things and never follows through. I mean, she's the one that said about Brett Kavanaugh, well, he told me he wouldn't, he respected Roe v. Wade as precedent.
I don't believe that, no.
And it's like, come on, okay, Supreme Court justices, they get to overturn precedent. All right, yes, lower court judges are required to abide by the controlling precedent. But when you're on the Supreme Court, you set precedent. You can definitely overturn, and they often do. So I just think that, again, she's a very thin reed to hang a lot of this on. And I want to say one more thing about Kavanaugh. Before any of this happened, before any of these allegations were raised, we were against him in Americans United because he has been very vocal in supporting the church-state perspective promoted by the late Chief Justice William Rehnquist. William Rehnquist, some of you may remember, was put on the court by President Nixon, and he was a prominent foe of separation of church and state. In a 1984 case, Rehnquist called the wall of separation between church and state based on bad history and said it should be frankly and explicitly abandoned. And he wrote this opinion attacking Thomas Jefferson and attacking his point of view. And Brett Kavanaugh holds up late Chief Justice Rehnquist as this towering intellectual figure who reconfigured the boundaries between church and state in this country. So we were against him long before any of this happened. This is terrible, this is all very bad, but his views are still horrible on this issue.
He's horrible, period.
So we can call our senators and our congressmen and women, and we can vote. But what else can you give us to hang our hats on with some hope?
With the Supreme Court, or just generally?
Just in general, because I think
general?
this. Yeah, we're pretty much done lobbying against Kavanaugh. I think there's a few phone calls to be made.
Yeah,
But
we're not.
I mean, you keep at it, but in a state like this, where you have a political situation where things kind of can go back and forth, it can make a difference. But nevertheless, okay, a little bit about. I talked in my remarks about how, despite how trying the times are and how challenging they are, I do think that there's cause for optimism because we are talking about a couple of long-term trends in this country that do break in a way that is more toward diversity. Growing Latino populations, the growing number of LGBTQ Americans who are stepping forth and asserting their rights. Women are energized by what's been going on. Now, and my wife and I were at the march the day after Trump's inauguration. We felt that energy in Washington, and it was wonderful to be part of that. But I will tell you, as much as that is powerful and really makes you feel like you're part of something larger than yourself, you have to follow through with voting and staying active and being involved. And the test of that's going to come in a few weeks, in November, when we see what happens. If people really are this angry. If the message sent is, yeah, we're pretty angry, the politicians got to sit up and pay attention to that. So we'll see. It's going to be an important election. Again, I can't tell you about parties to support or candidates to support. You have to make up your own mind. But we do know from past experiences, when you get a kind of really pivotal election where things just kind of change very aggressively, a message is sent, and politicians don't feel that they can just ignore that. They have to deal with that reality.
Right.
All right, 2 more questions and then we're done. Okay?
I understand in some Midwestern states that judges are actually allowing Sharia law to take precedent over some of our U.S. laws. Have you experienced this?
I have not heard that. I think what's happening is Sharia law, Islamic law, it has a couple of different facets. Sometimes it is used to deal with sort of family matters and family relations in a almost voluntary context in the way that you would go to mediation or something that's extra legal outside of the court system. And that's being used in those contexts voluntarily by all parties. If we had examples of religious law, be it Christian, Islamic, Buddhist, Hindu, whatever, infiltrating our legal system, being cited by courts, being used by courts, we would strongly stand up and oppose that. And there have been some cases where Muslim groups have asked for accommodations in the public school system that we feel go too far. You know, they want a special room set up for kids to go to pray in, you know, and special facilities put aside only for their use. Well, public schools simply can't do that kind of thing. If it's going to, obviously it has to allow students to pray voluntarily, you can't be setting up special facilities that one group gets to use and nobody else can even go into. So there have been some cases where we have found examples where we've had to say, all right, this is a little bit too much, this is a little bit too far. And there have been a couple of examples where public schools, in trying to teach about religion, have engaged in some activities that are problematic. And we have communicated with those school districts and said, you maybe need to refine these lessons and deal with them in different ways, because what you're doing is a little bit too much like religious worship. So there have been some cases like that, and we've tried to deal with them on a case-by-case basis.
I was wondering whether Americans United has ever had a chance to take a litigation against a law all of your own without some local case coming up first. Is that possible?
That is difficult to do because I'm not a lawyer. I just play one on TV. There's a legal principle known as standing. Standing is the right to sue. To get the right to sue, you've got to show injury. So if I'm a parent and I have kids in a public school and my kids have religion forced on them, I've got standing. My family's been harmed by what happened. My children have been exposed to a religion I may not agree with. I have standing. If I'm a taxpayer and my taxes are used to prop up a religious organization I don't agree with, I can probably get standing. So we rely on folks like you. You have the standing. In this case in Brevard County, for example, the local residents here are the ones being harmed by the policy of having only certain types of prayers, not being inclusive. So you have the standing, we have the legal firepower, and it's a pretty good partnership.
All right, last question, Jason.
Hello. In your personal opinion, or perhaps in your experience, do you think, should Vice President Pence be elevated up to president, should that happen, do you think it would change anything in this regard, in terms of our topic?
I know, that's a good question. I was asked that in Sarasota as well, and it is interesting because Pence is an interesting situation because I think Pence is a true believer. I mean, I've been following Pence's career from when he was in the House and governor of Indiana. He comes to these religious right meetings. I think he's a true believer. Whereas opposed to Trump, I mean, we all know Trump doesn't believe any of this religious stuff. It's the pandering, and and plus the evangelical community, they treat him like he's a new Messiah, and he loves that kind of thing. When somebody will be a sycophant and tell him how wonderful he is and give him positive feedback, he just feeds on that. So they're one of a few communities that hasn't abandoned him, the evangelical right. And something like 80% still support him, despite all that's happened. So you know, he doesn't believe any of it. Is someone like that, who fakes it, is an Elmer Gantry type character, more dangerous than a true believer?
No, sir.
Well, I don't know. I mean, some say yes, some say no. I have concerns. I mean, neither one is a good idea. Neither one is, what you want at the head. But back in the day when I first started working at Americans United, my greatest fear was that we were going to have someone ascend to high office who really was like a Pat Robertson type, who had those views, who sincerely believed them, but merged them with the sort of slick packaging of a seasoned political operative. Someone like that, right? I mean, never in my wildest dreams did I imagine that these attacks on separation of church and state would be ushered in by a failed real estate developer who until recently made his living hawking shoddy products on infomercials late at night and still couldn't sell them. Yet here we are. But folks, God works in mysterious ways.